All right, so in our never-ending battle of what we're going to do on verses, and you not wanting to do theme months for understandable reasons, except for some reason October, that seems like what always happens, this came to mind. You have an interesting story, and I want you to tell everyone what your interesting story about why you're doing this one in the first place.
No, that's...
I think that's funny. I'm sorry. So, we're going to introduce this, as we always do, and we're going to find out what happens. Oh, by the way, don't you love the fact I use Boyhood as the cryptic comment on this? When the Goonies battle Stand By Me. Hey, take it away.
There's really nothing to it.
It's funny.
I was watching a video of Dave Franco interviewing James Franco.
That's funny to me.
And he was just asking him questions, and then it got to choose one or the other, and he did a whole series of them, and one of them was Stand By Me or the Goonies. And I was just like, okay, there's one.
I think that's funny that's exactly how this versus exists.
That's the exact. So thank you, Dave Franco, I suppose.
For a lot of reasons. We cannot wait for the Disaster Artist.
Okay, so, we're going to start with, I think it's pretty obvious, what they have in common.
Yeah.
Apart from just Corey Feldman, but the whole... They're coming-of-age movies where the groups go on adventures and they find themselves and they learn about each other and their bonds and all that, and only one is like a real, touching movie, and the other is a big adventure movie.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, there's actually quite a bit of difference, but that's why we're going to talk about it. And I think we're going to start with Stand By Me, which obviously is based on the, a short story by Stephen King, which was called The Body.
Right.
And Rob Reiner as our director. And this was when he was like, I think he'd only done Spinal Tap and The Sure Thing by this point, but I think this is kind of what propelled him to, the greatness that he would, yeah, you could say greatness he would become, yeah. But nowadays you tend to forget how great it used to be. Because there was this, and then When Harry Met Sally, and then Misery, and then A Few Good Men, and just kind of all right in a row together. You kind of forget that Rob Reiner existed once when you look at today's lineup. But in the meantime, we start off actually with... I like the setup of the narrator played by Richard Dreyfuss, who is the adult version of Will Wheaton's character, who's kind of writing a story about this whole 2 days that goes down. Or we're to assume to. I'm assuming his book's about the entire 2 days and not just a portion of it. We never really learned that. But the thing about it is you would kind of think that having kind of a constant voiceover, generally that kind of brings things down. But it really, really brings that story-like quality to it. And Dreyfuss's voice is like the perfect fit for a voiceover. Especially with, kind of stories with this kind of emotional thing. He's just kind of got that, like you're being told the tale by your grandma or something. Or in this case, your dad would have been. In the 80s, he still would have been. And as it plays out, there's an immediate... This is another one of those movies where, although it's not set in a time that you were alive in, all the nostalgia is still very much there for you because of how relatable the whole friendship dynamic thing is throughout, decades. So, and this is kind of the one, talking about the Goonies, real quick, the way the Goonies plays out, when the way those characters interact, when the Goonies ends, you're kind of under the impression that those guys are going to be friends forever. And on the opposite end of that, Stand By Me is more like, surely at one point or another, I know I was, when you're in school and you're in your preteen days, there's that group of friends you have that you probably shouldn't be hanging out with, who have the really bad families and have they talk about being abused very nonchalantly, almost like they're bragging about it. and typically have, possibly violent tendencies, and you just kind of know looking at them that they're gonna be trouble for a very long time. Some of the people that this gives me memories of in my own life are in jail as we speak, and that's not even a joke. So, but the really interesting and great thing that this movie does, is these characters are so layered and so, like, surprisingly intelligent for their ages, that it's not just they're the bad kids and they're hanging out with, the good kid. It's the whole, they know that they're different from him and that they're basically bad influences, and they're ones where when you're friends, you're not really thinking about the fact that you just kind of gradually drift apart, no matter how close your bond is. Sooner or later, that just kind of happens. You don't really talk about it. There's no kind of final conversation about it or anything. There's just a drifting that just kind of happens that you just barely acknowledge. And it's something that doesn't even register with you until you realize how long it's been since you've seen that person. The characters in this movie seem to know that they're headed in that direction already. And that's what makes the dynamic between them really interesting and different from what we normally see in coming-of-age movies. And it's kind of like, it's kind of funny that Richard Dreyfuss is our narrator, because it kind of gives that same feel of what American Graffiti did. Where American Graffiti is this really happy-go-lucky movie where everybody's just out having fun and they're embracing their young years one last time. And then the "Where Are They Now" text comes up at the end, and it's really suddenly depressing. Which is a really fucking great moment in American Graffiti. This is basically kind of like a whole thing in that direction, but the characters in the movie kind of know that's where they're going. To the point that Chris is even smart enough to tell him that, like, there's that scene where he actually says, "Dude, you gotta, like, stop hanging out with us. You gotta go on to better things, because we're just gonna be stuck here." And there's the really depressing scene where he's just kind of looking out into the abyss and says, like, 12 years old, he comes to the conclusion, "I'm never gonna leave this town in my life, am I?" And of course, the thing about it, there's something looming over the whole movie, which is, at the very start of the movie, we already know Chris's fate. About him being stabbed in a restaurant. And killed, which is kind of where this sets off Dreyfuss's memories of this moment. These past 2 days that happened. And the interesting thing about it is, not only is Chris our character, but he's basically... Chris being a peer is basically kind of saying everything that his actual dad should be. Because there's the whole other plot line where Will Wheaton's older brother was John Cusack, who was like the star athlete, and everybody in town knew him. He was going to go on to great big things, and then he died in a car accident, and his family basically just shut down and went into a robotic mode. And he's always had that looming feeling that he doesn't know what he's going to do, and Cusack was going to be the big thing, and it was Cusack that died instead of him, and now he feels like he's not even supposed to be here at all. So Chris is basically the only thing he has to kind of push him in the direction he needs to go. I particularly love the line when he's saying, when he's just kind of talking himself down, and Chris says, "That's your dad talking, that's not you," and he says, "Bullshit," and Chris's response to that is, "Bull true!" So that's and you just love the complexity of that character, because you already know, the thing about it, that kind of adds to the complexity is, I've always wondered if, showing the headline of Chris's death at the very beginning of the movie is an intentional fake out. Because when you see this character that knows he's a bad kid and knows the direction he's going, because he has an older brother that's already reached that point, and he just knows he's heading in his older brother's direction. If it's a bit of a fake out that when we learned that once he got older he was stabbed, it could have been anything that was his fault. Despite the fact that we do learn he actually made it to being an attorney before that happened. But regardless, with the way his character is, we kind of spend the movie wondering if he got himself into that mess, and then at the very end we learn that it was because he was trying to break up a fight and wasn't actually in one himself that got him killed. And I thought that was a really... this whole character is just really heartbreaking. And I don't know, another thing kind of looming over it too is the whole, you look at the young cast with Will Wheaton and River Phoenix and Jerry O'Connell and Corey Feldman, and at the end of the movie we learn that the three of them went on to do their own thing, good or bad, and one of them didn't make it very far. And it just so happens, the way it lines up, that Chris in real life is the one that didn't, among the four of them as well. So that brings kind of a whole other tragedy to this character that real life brought to it, which is very... Yeah, okay. Being a coming-of-age movie and something you can relate to nostalgically, even if you're not from the period, it's worth noting how really fucking depressing this movie is. Because once this... Because there's no real... I don't know what I'm... Yeah, there's definitely a tragedy in there, despite the fact that we've known about it the whole time. And it does end, obviously, on kind of a happy note, because, you know, he finishes the book, and he's got a family, and he's happy in the spot that he's in now. But there's that whole... There's just a whole other thing going on, kind of underlying, that really adds a depressing quality to this, to where we're all just kind of either... 95% of us are destined for nothing or a quick death. So, it's... yeah. And then, another thing over this is, talking about the other characters also, obviously Corey Feldman is great here. He's the one that's kind of... We kind of have Chris, who's the kid that's from the bad family, but the one that's comes from more of a more, like, abusive background is, Teddy. Who actually has a deformity from where his dad held his ear to a stove and is now locked up somewhere. And the thing about Teddy is that he's kind of the one where he has such... So he's the kid that can, you know, jump around and sing and dance and be the funny one. And then he's the one that can just snap and be violent or get really emotional. And you really have no idea what circumstances he's in, which direction they're going to send him in. Because he could go... Any type of situation he finds himself in can send him to one extreme or the other. And there's never really a clue as to which one that's going to be. So that's a very... He's basically kind of a ticking time bomb character. Another thing is very... the ironic scene with Chris... when they're watching Teddy go off and pretend he's in the war and stuff like his dad supposedly was. He stormed the beach at Normandy. Chris says about Teddy, he won't live to be past his 20s. Even though we know going in that it's actually Chris that happens to. I always thought that was kind of an unsettling moment. Even though we know that Teddy's outcome wasn't necessarily good either. But definitely, despite all this, the movie's also really funny, too. Just between the dynamic of them and the whole, just the way, the script for this is really good. I believe it's an Oscar-nominated script, too. I think it was the only nomination it got. And there's that moment I love where they're sitting around the campfire, and Teddy talks about, the comedian Abbott Costello. One person, Abbott Costello. And then there's obviously Jerry O'Connell, who is our he's basically the kid you relate to if you're not the kid with a lot of promise or the bad kids. He's the one that just kind of settled down and had a normal life, and then he's just kind of, you know, doing a boring job and just doing that whole thing. And he's the one that's kind of scared of everything, and he's kind of the fuck up of all of them, despite the fact that he's the one that kind of sets this whole thing off, because he's the one that figures out about the body. And there's moments where, like, they should probably be bringing, like, food and other assorted things that they will need, and the only thing he brings is a comb for when the cameras come when they become famous. And it's and it's the whole, did you bring food? Did you bring food? No, I brought the comb. And then it's this big tragic moment when he loses the comb on the train track. So, yeah, and then of course, like I said, Cusack makes a big impression with only 2 scenes, because he really embodies that. This was kind of the direction that Gordy was supposed to go, and he was going to be the big influence, but he kind of lost that when he lost his brother, and everything just kind of came crashing down. There's that really eerie scene where he has the nightmare about his brother's funeral, and his dad turns to him and says, "It should have been you." And it's... And then, on top of this cast, we have our antagonist, who is Kiefer Sutherland, who is basically the whole embodiment of the direction that they will be headed if the bad kids keep up what they're doing, and should Gordy fall in with them, they'll all end up being like Ace, which is the worst place you can be. And the only thing we know that Ace is like crazy and a bully and all that other stuff. But the only clue we get as to why he is the way he is a line that Teddy says, I think. It's Teddy or Chris, when they're talking to him, and they say, why don't you go fuck your mother some more? And that's kind of the only clue we get of his background. And that in itself, go fuck your mother is just a regular insult. But when you add some more to the end of it, that kind of means that insult's coming from somewhere. So, somewhere potentially real. So, we don't really know what Ace's deal is. We just know that he is what they will become if they don't straighten their lives up. And a lot of them kind of head in that direction anyway, sadly. And the thing about it is, another big thing involving Ace's character is when he and Gordy kind of have that showdown, when Gordy pulls the gun on him. And it's this big moment where not only are we just kind of facing off with our antagonist, because that's just a whole thing in itself, but then we have how Gordy has all this stuff, like, on his shoulders, with the whole, he lost his brother, he's upset he never cried at his brother's funeral, he thinks his family doesn't want him, he feels like he has no place, he's probably about to fall in with the bad kids and become somebody like Ace. So that moment when he pulls the gun on Ace isn't just getting his bully to back off. It's basically kind of a moment where he's kind of facing everything all at once. Because right before Ace showed up, he was having that whole breakdown about how all of this stuff was just riding on him. And then it's like when he pulls the gun on Ace, he's kind of facing everything that's all fucked up in his life all at once. Like, he's seeing Ace as kind of everything that's bothering him in his life at the moment, and not just the kind of antagonist in this story. And of course, if you want the ultimate best portrayal ever of a bully, you get 80s Kiefer Sutherland. There was no bully like 80s Kiefer Sutherland. So that's just fantastic. And yeah, just on top of this, I do love the way the narration gives it a story quality, as I was saying. With the whole... just sometimes a line would come in there that just fits absolutely perfect. There's the whole Chopper Sick Balls monologue. And then I always love the line, finding new and disgusting ways to degrade one's mother was held in high regard. But the best thing about the whole narrator arc is... the last scene of the movie is, obviously you have, the narrator kind of adding to it as he speaks about it. But the best line given by the narrator is one that he doesn't say. It's when we see him type the last line of his book. And he doesn't say it out loud, and his voiceover doesn't read it to us. We just see him type it out, and then he gets up and he leaves, and the movie ends. And that one line that we see him type sums up everything. When it's, I'll never have friends like I did when I was 12, Jesus does anybody. And that one unspoken line that we see typed out just kind of brings the whole thing to the point. And that's just... it couldn't have ended on a better note. after all the great stuff that's already happened. Also, one more thing I wanted to throw out there real quick was when Gordy tells his story about the Barforama. Obviously my favorite scene. I'm hoping you hit the sarcasm, of course. The thing about that is, what's interesting about that scene is right in the middle of the movie, we know obviously Gordy's building up to wanting to be a writer. And then we actually have this moment where he's telling them a story that he has off the top of his head, and that kind of the fact that we see the story, like if he just told the story, that'd be one thing, but the fact that we see the story play out should have been out of place, but somehow the way Reiner kind of handled it and kind of put it in the story and at the moment that he did, somehow, despite the fact that this should really be kind of off-putting and take us out of the movie, it seems to just really fit for some reason. Like, it's totally and completely outlandish, clearly, and extremely over the top, yet somehow in the middle of this very real movie, it just kind of fits. Where you kind of throw in that little fantasy world that kids have in the middle of all this glaring reality. It actually fits quite well in there, and you would just think that's not the case at all. But so yes, that's definitely, I believe, to thank for Reiner's direction. So having said all that, now we have the Goonies, which does seem very low after you come off Stand By Me, because, like I said, you do have a great friendship dynamic there, and there's a lot of great, likable, memorable characters in this. But for the most part, it's a Steven Spielberg adventure movie. It's Spielberg came up with the story, Chris Columbus wrote it, and Richard Donner directed. And we have all these kids who basically, every single one of them basically became memorable, because this movie is like the ultimate, I wouldn't even say cult movie, because there's way too many fans of it. Mm-hmm. This movie is huge to people and their childhoods. And the thing about it is, this was Spielberg at his absolute most, like, Spielberg-like. Like, we had just had Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then E.T., and then this is kind of a combination. It's like if you took the kids from E.T. and you put them in Raiders of the Lost Ark, is what you get with this movie. And that really brings kind of a magic to it that really definitely... It's really not that hard to understand how it stuck with so many people and continues to. And not to mention, another thing this movie does really well that a lot of movies of this thing like this don't. I think that's another thing is, I'm really building on here, but I think what makes the Goonies work so well for so many people is that there are a lot of movies like it, but they're not handled in a way to where when you watch this, all the kids in the movie feel like kids that you would know and hang out with in real life. And there's probably depending on your friend group, there's probably somebody you can relate to at least 2 or 3 of them. And the performances of all of them really, really help that. As far as the faces that we still recognize now, obviously there's Sean Astin and Josh Brolin and Corey Feldman, and then we have the likes of... obviously, Data was most well known for being Short Round in Temple of Doom. Cary Green, I only think I remember seeing in Lucas. I don't remember much apart from those other two. And Martha Blundin's kind of had a resurgence. She was on that show, and then she had a big part as River Phoenix's love interest in Running on Empty. So she's been around as well. And then we have... Did I ever look at Chunk? Jesus Christ. Oh my god, I almost forgot Chunk. I'm the worst Goonies reviewer of all time.
Oh god.
Oh shit. Yes, and I was just about to say, there is a reason he is the most beloved character, because I don't believe Jeff Cohen's acting anymore. I think he's like an agent now or something. He's something along the lines of that. But he looks nothing like this now. But this performance is so good. Because generally you have to have the bumbling kid that's kind of the really funny one that's there for even when we're in the most serious of moments, will be the comedy relief, just kind of as a constant. Like, I can't think of one scene that Chunk has that's not supposed to be funny. And his performance is so good that he maintains that the whole time. Like, that's kind of a challenge to have. It seems like a bad idea to have one character who's funny all the time. Because they all kind of have to have their, serious moments. Maybe there's like one quick scene that Chunk has that's kind of a real moment. But for the most part, throughout the entire movie, he has to be this over-the-top, bumbling mess of a person. But he's so good that he is always funny. It never wears thin throughout the entire 2-hour movie. That takes comedic talent to be able to do that. And when you're just a kid, all the more so. Just whether it be delivery or just what he's doing in the scene or what it is. Just his likability in general, too. And you would think he would be really, really unlikable because he's the one that's always fucking everything up just because of how much of a klutz he is. But it just kind of makes you love him even more the way he is. I think it's safe to understand why Chunk is kind of the character that people most remember when they leave this movie. Despite the fact that every character kind of having their moment. I know, I would assume Mouth is quite popular among the fan bases as well, because he's kind of the wannabe Fonzie type, and he just doing that whole thing. Well, that's definitely a friend that we all knew. If there's one character in this movie that we all had in our friend group, Mouth was probably that person. And then we have the Fratellis, where we have Anne Ramsey, who's most famous, I think, for throwing on from the train, I would assume, besides this. And the brothers, who are Robert Davi and Joe Pantoliano, who also have a really great dynamic every time we cut back to them. The scene where they're about to shoot each other over pizza, for one thing. And that's... Having all these characters really, really kind of makes this... you have a Spielberg adventure amongst all this. But if you didn't have kids that were this likable and this memorable, this movie was never gonna... This was just gonna be a really cheap Raiders knockoff, and that was gonna be the end of it. And nobody's gonna really care about it except maybe one or two people that tried to defend it every now and then. I really think it's the performances and the characters that really made this... the big thing that it was. And that's not even to mention Sloth. Obviously, Sloth has 3 intelligible lines, all of which are quoted constantly when this movie comes up. Because you have him watching The Seahawk with Errol Flynn, or he was watching Captain Blood. The ship, I think, was inspired by The Seahawk, though. It's one or the other on those two. I'm pretty sure he's watching Captain Blood, though. I remember that scene specifically. And it kind of gives that quality to it on top of the kind of Indiana Jones feel. So there's all that, and of course, me speaking as somebody that's not a huge Indiana Jones fan by any means, just put all your hate elsewhere. But another thing about it is how well we feel like we know them when the movie's barely been on. There's that one moment where they're up in the attic. And Mikey's trying to get into the glass to get to the map. So he knows to hand it to Chunk because Chunk is going to drop it when he counts down to 5. Because that's just what Chunk does. And while we've just met these characters, and Chunk's like the last one we meet. Because he gets to the house last. But when that moment comes really early in the movie... What makes it so funny is that they've established themselves so quickly into our memories and hearts that we know Chunk that well, that how funny it is. We feel like we're in on an in-joke 15 minutes into the movie in that scene where he has Chunk handle the picture because he knows he's going to drop it. Because we know Chunk's going to drop it and we've known him for 10 minutes. And then, of course, the brotherly relationship between... Mikey and Brian, Sean Astin and Josh Brolin, where they have a lot. Obviously, Brolin plays the big brother character really well, where he has to correct everything everybody says, because for some reason everybody around him says the wrong thing. To the point that Mikey has asthma, and there's actually a point where Bran just almost endearingly calls him limp lungs. This is the relationship they have. Yes, my own brother was subject to a lot of fat jokes, so it's just a brotherly thing. But then you have that moment when they're confronted by Troy's dad about the foreclosure, and it's a really serious moment. When Mikey's just watching the rain and he's kind of going into a depression, and Bran comes out and they have that hug, and you realize that there's, despite all the name calling and the banter, there's a real brotherly relationship between the two of them. And Bran's going to be really protective of him regardless. Now, another thing that comes to mind, though, is that I don't know about everybody else, but another thing that sets this apart from being some kid's adventure movie is when I was little, my brother was the one that really loved this movie between the two of us. When I was little, this movie terrified me. I found this movie absolutely frightening and could barely watch it when I was... Because for starters, you have Sloth, who is very jarring when you first see him, especially when you're a kid. And then you have the fact that the Fratellis are murderers who have dead bodies with bullets in their heads laying around in this dark place. You have the skeleton of Chester Cobblepot scared the holy shit out of me. The skeletons on the ship, particularly the one with the knives in its eyes, that shit freaked me out. You would not see that kind of stuff in a kid's adventure film today.
No.
You just would not.
Not even close.
You wouldn't get PG anyway. So... I think that's kind of another thing that gives it a real quality of, despite the fact that, yeah, the kids are, there's a silly quality to it, and the kids have a very, they're very kid-like, sure, but at the same time, underneath, there's a moment where Robert Davi gets hit, and there's, like, cartoon sound effects. But apart from the silliness that's going on, there's also a maturity to this movie that's not in a lot of kids' adventure movies, like, from this era. It's not even worth noting today. But also in this era, most kid adventure movies were kid adventure movies. Whereas here, it's a kid adventure movies where kids watching it can actually feel like they're in peril with it. So I think that's another thing that kind of really amps up the adventure quality that adventure movies of this also then don't really have. So, and it's not, okay, I was never into this movie as much as everybody else. It's it was never, a lot of people I know say it's one of their all-time favorites. Mm. A lot of people. Probably a majority of the people I know. It was never really even close to being one of my favorites, per se. But there's definitely a quality to it, and I've seen it 50 or 100 times, or I don't know how many. As is pretty much everybody. You're the only person I know that's only seen it once.
Yeah.
And not only are you the only person I know that's only seen it once, you're the only person I know that hasn't seen it 50 times.
I was watching Smokey and the Bandit and Cannonball Run when I was a kid.
So it's certainly... Oh, I'm so sorry about that Cannonball Run, but...
I like that movie. I'm sorry.
So... Yes, it's definitely secured a legacy for itself. And there's always talk about that sequel that may or may not happen. I don't know. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but Hollywood's going to do what it's going to do, and people are going to want what they want, and that's great. So obviously, I think Stand By Me is a far superior whole thing in itself. But the Goonies certainly has the following that it has. It's not hard at all to see why it's so beloved, so...
Right.
Yeah.
That's what we've got.
I think so.
So ends another edition of Versus, and next week your cryptic comment is, that's all, folks. So try to figure out what we're talking about there.
2 movies I have no idea how I'm going to go about reviewing, but hopefully I'll figure it out by then.
Well, after you get done watching The Force Awakens, you can come back here and check out something rather animated in its own right. So that being said, thank you guys and girls out there for watching. Don't forget later tonight, as soon as the pay-per-view finishes, we're going to be talking TLC on the WWE Popcast. And tomorrow is Raw, and of course, a lot of great stuff coming for Pop this week. And like I said, Star Wars The Force Awakens is coming this Friday, so stay tuned for that review, along with Sisters and The Road Ship. That being said, thank you guys and girls out there for watching. And AJ, any parting words?